everybody, and big thanks to Mikey for that session, because I think he managed to bring a huge amount of energy into the room straight after lunch. And there's a beautiful intersect between what he's been talking about with culture and what I'm going to be talking about in terms of building resilience. Now, my biggest challenge for this afternoon is going to be maintaining my voice, so I hope you'll bear with me through that. And because I'm in high heels, I'm going to stand behind the lectern. I don't quite trust myself too close to that edge. So I am super lucky to be part of the team of psychologists at Chandler Macleod, because every day we get to really work with individuals and organisations to help extend people what they're achieving, what they're able to do within their businesses and become the best that they can be. So that's a really exciting place for me. But as a psychologist, we do tend to deal a lot with data and research, and we really like strategies. So a lot of what I'm going to do this afternoon is to try to make sure I equip you over the next half hour with a whole bunch of things that you can do to build resilience for yourself as well as for the organisation that you're leading or that you're working with. And it's a really exciting opportunity. So thanks to Tanda for inviting us along this afternoon to present. I was really excited this morning when I was listening to the very beginning of the day, where the Tanda speakers were talking about the 4 pillars of success for creating mastery at work. Because everything I'm going to be talking about this afternoon fits right into those pillars of being driven, about being open-minded, about feeling empowered, and about using our strengths to create success. So to set the scene a little bit, we're going to be talking about what resilience is and why we need to protect it as we go about our busy world. I'm going to introduce strategies, like I said, that you're going to be able to build into your own life at home, but also some ideas that you can bring into your business. So let's start by looking at why resilience matters. I know every single person in this room is busy. Most of us feel like our workloads are getting heavier, our days seem to be getting longer. Lots of us feel that the scope of the work we do is growing, and the way we are working is getting more complex all the time. And this has impacts for us both in our personal and professional domains. And left unchecked, this kind of increased pressure and stress at work can start to leach across into the lives we live at home as well. It can impact the relationships that we have with the people we love if we don't take care around it. Within our work, the impact of too much stress and pressure can be seen through increased absentee rates amongst our staff, reduced efficiencies, and in some instances it can even cause the increased rates of workforce accidents and injuries. So obviously these are things to be avoiding where we can. So why is it that being busy at work impacts on us so much? To explain this, I'm going to spend some time talking about how our brains work. I'm a psychologist. We love a good brain picture. I'd like us all to better understand that while usually our brains are doing a really good job of taking care of us, sometimes things get a little bit out of hand and our brains can actually get into some patterns which maybe are not doing us so much good, and they can actually start to do us harm if we're not careful. So to do this, we're going to take a look at neuroscience and how it explains the impact of stress. And put simply, neuroscience is just the study of the biological mechanisms of the brain. And we know that there's at least 150 neurochemicals in our brain that do all sorts of different things. But this afternoon I'm just going to be talking about 5 of them that they're specifically biologically designed to promote survival. And those 5 are on the screen here. First though, I want to travel back in time a few 100,000 years to when our brains first developed this clever system of survival. Our brain instincts were to gain rewards like having sufficient food and securing relationships which serve to protect us and promote well-being by keeping us out of physical danger. And we also needed to develop a pretty clever system that alerted us to threat. So when danger was presented to us, we were able to do something to keep ourselves safe. And we needed to learn to do this really fast. If we're about to be under attack, you don't want to be sitting and thinking about what's happening. We need to be working really quickly with survival shortcuts, which reduce our need to do that kind of complex problem solving and just jump to let us act on instinct. And so this is where those neurochemicals really come in handy, because each of them play a role in helping our brains to promote our survival. Each of them serve an associated but slightly different purpose. I'll go through them one by one. Firstly, and you would have seen on the list on the previous page, were the endorphins. And you might think about endorphins as being that hit we get when maybe you've probably heard about runners talking about the runner's high. That's the endorphin hit. But the real purpose of that is to help diminish our perception of pain. And you can probably imagine that from a survival point of view, being able to manage pain is pretty important because it helps us push past that point of exhaustion and to deal with difficulties and challenges, even when we think there's nothing left in the tank. In the modern world, endorphins are still pretty handy. They help us survive really late nights and long weeks at work. But obviously we have to be a little bit careful we're not overusing that. We don't want to sort of overuse a resource which if we push ourselves too far is actually going to start to hurt us. The next of those neurochemicals was dopamine, and it's sometimes called the leadership chemical because of its significance in driving us to seek short-term reward and achievement. And it's the feeling we get when we've just finished a really challenging task, we've completed something difficult, and we get that little buzz, that sense of satisfaction of a job well done. The next one on the list was serotonin, and that's that hit we get when we feel that others perceive, that people respect us or like us. It's what makes us feel proud and strong and confident. It's that thing that used to make us come home from school and tell our parents when we'd done a good job, or we go to our boss and we talk about the fact we've achieved something. That desire to self-promote and get that kind of feedback. It helps us to feel like we can take on the world, even when things feel pretty tough. So it also drives us to push our status, to improve our status, by pushing the urge for social approval and also reinforcing the bonds we have with the people around us who we like. We want to impress the people who impress us, really. And the fourth one on the list was oxytocin, which sometimes is called the love chemical. It triggers feelings of friendship and love and respect and deep trust. And most of us like those feelings. I think you'd enjoy. I think you'd agree. And it's the sort of feeling we get when we do something nice for someone. We get it when someone does something nice for us. It's the reason they put those feel-good stories on the news, because we get that nice little buzz of oxytocin. And without it, we'd actually be a lot less likely to perform acts of generosity or altruism. So we're quite driven to have that little buzz come through and make us feel good. So, as you can probably tell, these 4 neurochemicals really developed for the purpose of driving us to seek the reward of positive relationships, and that was really quite singly designed to promote our physical safety and security. Definitely important for our survival, as it helped us to be able to safely depend on the community around us. And these mechanisms still have a really important place in the modern world to help us feel satisfied with our lives, with our work, and with our relationships. But even the urge for status and love and positive feelings can come at a cost if we start to lose a balance on that and we fail to retain sufficient focus on other aspects of our life. So if we get a little bit over-invested in having that hit in a certain direction. So the other critical chemical that I wanted to talk about was cortisol. It's another important part of the brain recipe. So cortisol, which you probably are also pretty familiar with. I've had a bit of a hit of it this afternoon before I came up on stage and I knew that I needed to talk. It elevates under stress and it contributes to the defence mechanism that stimulates our fight and flight response. And it's that quick instinct was really critical to that Paleolithic version of us where we needed to get away from immediate threat. It wasn't in our best interest to try to understand a threat. We just need to boost our survival by getting out fast from threatening situations. And that's by any means necessary. And just like our prehistoric ancestors, our prime instinct from cortisol today is still to drive that urge for survival through fight or flight. And fighting or fleeing both require some quite specific physical and mental responses. And they happen as soon as that cortisol release happens. So some of the classic responses, and you might recognise them in yourself in times where you've felt that there's really intense pressure or you've had a big fright, but you might recognise an increase in heart rate, your breathing rate increases, your blood pressure goes up. And what's happening also at that time you might not be quite so aware of, about our glycogen stores suddenly start to break down into glucose. And that gives us that instant energy to our muscles, which once upon a time let us run away. But so it increases the muscular capacity and our alertness and reaction speed. And interestingly, it also increases our cognitive speed. We actually think better when this is all happening. But I guess the really important question is whether or not this cortisol hit is still useful in our modern world. And the answer is yes. This afternoon, it's really important to me. If I hadn't had that happening, it wouldn't kind of get me ready to get up here and talk with energy. But it's only useful to a point. Unfortunately, that ancient survival mechanism hasn't really adapted that well to the modern situation of modern-day stresses. And the threats we face at work, unless your job is very different to mine, as a rule are not life-threatening. So if you are facing life-threatening events on a day-to-day basis at work, I think we need to talk about something a little bit different. But unfortunately, our cortisol still gets released as if we're in that life-threatening situation. Now, short term, that's not really a problem. It hasn't done me any harm this afternoon to have a good hit of cortisol to get up here and talk. But the problems can really start to arise when we're trying to live with chronic high stress levels. And this can affect us in all kinds of really quite problematic ways. We know that it actually inhibits cell growth and repair, starts to get affected. Our immune system can become suppressed. So we know we're actually much more likely to catch a cold. We'll take longer to heal when our chronic cortisol is being released into the system. And an early sign of problems for a lot of people is actually when sleep becomes disrupted. So that can often be the first cue to people that something's going on that shouldn't be. And if you needed any more incentive to worry about chronic cortisol and stress, then unfortunately I've got to tell you it's also going to increase the likelihood of us gaining weight, and it'll even start to affect our libido. So it kind of goes across the board of all sorts of not good things. So let's look at how these neurological processes operate to create survival shortcuts. Because while we've evolved and adapted, the way we feel still directly influence the thoughts we have, the decisions we make, and the behaviours we display. And that's both at home and at work. So let's talk about this one by one. During any event, our emotional brain, that quick response, instantly creates a tag that labels an event as either a reward or a threat experience. The emotions tagged to rewards are typically positive, and those that are tagged as threat emotions are typically negative. The relevant emotion tag is then communicated to our logical thinking brain, and it helps us to make those really fast determinations about whether something is good or bad, better or best, whether it requires urgent attention or not so much. And even without that opportunity to deeply process an event, our brain is trying to help us. It's trying to help us understand the world as either being a rewarding or a threatening place. And it's trying to help us work out the most appropriate behavioural response in those situations. But depending on which emotional tag has been sent from the emotional brain and to our thinking brain, that might enhance or it might impair the way we function next. So when we receive a positive emotional tag, like feeling satisfied or valued or useful, like the ones that might have been triggered with the release of dopamine and serotonin and those other chemicals I was talking about before, it actually starts to enhance our functioning. We start to think more openly, we're more creative, we're able to think more laterally. And so when we experience these positive emotions, we tend to be more open to new ideas, we feel more engaged, we're more willing to do difficult things, and we're able to develop new solutions. We're more motivated to think more deeply about things, and we're even in a better place to be open for learning. So it really does start to open our mind up to be able to do all sorts of much more high-level things that promote our creativity and capacity. But on the other hand, negative emotional tags like worry, frustration and stress tend to limit our functioning, and they narrow our thinking. They limit our ability to interpret events. We start to become focused on threat to the point that this can actually diminish our cognitive response, our resources, and make us more biased in our views. We lose our capacity to objectively evaluate situations and to be able to conceptualise what the best response is. So I want you to maybe make sense of this by thinking about a reasonably ambiguous situation. So perhaps you've just received a message or an email saying that one of your clients urgently wants to make a meeting with you, but there's no information there about what it is they want to talk about. Now, depending on what emotion tag you create, you might feel like that's a threatening situation, that this is bad news coming. Or if you create a positive tag to that, that might actually leave you thinking, this is a golden opportunity. They want to do business. They want to give me positive feedback. Obviously, that's going to then influence how you react next, what you do, and whether the optimal response is selected. So, neuroscience helps us to understand how emotions influence our decisions, our behaviour and our performance. But the reality is these processes are really automated and very fast. And as I said before, they create cognitive shortcuts. So quite a lot of the time, probably at least 85% of the time, we're not fully conscious of what we're feeling. Those thoughts are popping into our head in an automated way. And unfortunately, the shortcuts aren't always accurate. Sometimes we misallocate those tags. And if we're doing that in a repetitive way, over time, that can start to result in quite poor patterns of responding. For this reason, it's really important that we develop awareness into the patterns we have. We're able to keep some balance between how we're thinking about things, how we're using all of those different neuro resources, and making sure our brain is operating in the best possible way so we can promote our emotional intelligence and also really build that psychological resilience. Okay, the end of the neuroscience lesson. Let's talk about what resilience is, since that's what the presentation's all about. Well, resilience can be simply defined as the ability to adapt to stress and adversity. So it can be seen as our capacity to bounce back when things have been negative or threatening, to come back to that normal state of functioning, to be able to recover. Now, it's not a completely innate function, which other people either have or they don't have. Levels of resilience do differ from person to person. So some people probably do start with a baseline of increased resilience. But the good news is all of us can build the resilience that we have and get better at encouraging that resource, that capacity in ourselves. So the underlying capacity is there. And really, we build those strategies through systematic practice of a range of little techniques, some of which I'm going to be introducing to you soon. And when we do that on a regular basis, when we build that technique and we build that into our regular life, we start to become more adept at interpreting events a little bit more accurately, realising perhaps when we're using a misplaced negative emotional tag, and we can bring ourselves across to use the positive emotion tag and respond in those effective ways. When we're doing that really ideally, even when things get tough, we're able to bounce back in the most optimal way so we don't have too many battle scars at the end of the most difficult of circumstances. And I thought that this quote from someone who has certainly dealt with his share of adversity in life was a really beautiful one, which is the greatest glory in living lies not in never failing, but in rising every time we fail. every time we fall. So, sign me up. How do I become one of these resilient people? So hopefully that's what you're thinking by now. The first step is increasing the awareness of when the balance is off, as I've said, and when we might be relying on those less useful emotional markers, reacting in less optimal ways. But I want you to think about whether you are consciously aware most of the time about when you're stressed. I'm going to list some of the common signs of stress. I want you to just to spend some time reflecting as I speak about whether you recognise these symptoms in yourself. And we're going to go through the physical signs, the emotional signs, the behavioural and the cognitive. So just starting up with the physical. If you're noticing your heart rate's elevated, you're sweaty, you're nauseous, you're not necessarily sure why, maybe you've got some chronic indigestion, muscle soreness, sleep disturbance, restlessness. Emotional. We can see this when people are feeling very teary without good reason, irritable, angry and reactive. Or sometimes it's through feeling numb. Lots of fears that don't have good explanation or anxiety. Or sometimes it's that feeling flat, like things aren't feeling like they should be. Behaviourally, sometimes we find ourselves withdrawing from our friends, our family. We get a little bit more reactive in situations than we normally would. We feel ourselves wanting to escape, to run away. And we can actually start to do some really quite maladaptive things, like using alcohol and other substances. And things are really getting pretty problematic when we get to that point. Cognitively, we can see some disorders of thinking. We don't think as effectively, as clearly. We get that kind of foggy brain. Concentration goes down. And we can find ourselves going over and over, worrying about things and feeling less creative than we normally do. Now, I'm really hoping that none of you recognised too many of those. But if you are recognising even some, that might be a sign to you that stress is getting a little bit chronic and things are not feeling as good as they could be. So once we become more aware of our stress, we have a chance to assess if we're responding in the most optimal of ways to situations where we feel under threat. We become much better at changing our responses when we need to. And really importantly, we can become more emotionally aware and resilient people, and that puts us in a much better position to be supporting the people around us, including the people who are in our workforce. So, we're going to talk about the resilience strategies, and they're across these 4 areas. Now, what we know about resilient people, or more resilient people, is they use a range of techniques from each of those areas that I just had up. And it can be a good goal to aim for in terms of thinking about the strategies which might work for you, to pick and choose from across those different areas. But really, if you're adding any of these strategies to your repertoire, you're going to be feeling that you'll be managing your emotions more effectively and building that resilience. And if your main motivation to coming to this presentation is to be thinking about how to build resilience within your workforce rather than yourself, that's okay. I'll challenge you to be thinking about the sorts of strategies which maybe you can bring across to work. Because we know that happy, positive, resilient staff are going to be more effective, more efficient, and that's so critical in terms of building and maintaining successful businesses. So I'm going to start by talking about strategies which help to change the environment we live in. And there are lots of things that we can do to change the way our world looks, sounds, smells and feels, to make it more enjoyable, a more calm environment, a more positive environment. Big business is really into these environmental strategies where they really aim to make customers feel certain ways and employees be as productive as possible. You might have noticed even walking into the hotel today, and there's smells, they create that feel as we come in, and large department stores, casinos, a lot of these sorts of businesses will use these same practices. They set it up so there is a feel that makes people enjoy being in that space. And some of the other strategies on there, like structuring specific times where perhaps we're going to accept our phone calls or manage our emails, instead of being constantly open to all those competing demands and interruptions, they can also make a huge difference. But I do recognise it takes some discipline to put those strategies in place and get the habits so they feel like they're natural to us. The next really important area to consider is the relationships we keep. And we need to remember that those neurochemicals I was talking about are really driven in this. So the feeling of being loved and liked, feeling admired, those are really important. And establishing effective and supportive relationships at work is critical with our leaders, with our peers, and also with the people who report to us. Some of the things we can do, establishing effective mentorships and support networks, but it's really important to ensure that we have a good alignment between the individuals involved. And if you're seeking a mentor or a coach for yourself, the people you choose really need to be objective to be able to help you. It's probably helpful if they're not experiencing exactly the same environment or context that you're in, because that's going to let them be a little bit more objective. The perspective that they can give you will give an increased capacity. But at the end of the day, talking with others is useful because it engages the thinking brain, and in doing so dampens that effect of that instant emotional brain. It helps us think more deeply and objectively. For many people, the physical behaviours are the ones that spring to mind when we think about resilience. And some people think it's all about massages and meditation and yoga retreats. But really, it's implementing simple day-to-day strategies that is really where we can get some bang for the buck for psychological well-being. And unfortunately, even though most of us know that eating well, getting enough physical activity and sleeping enough is important, most of us probably aren't using these strategies enough, which is kind of crazy because they're really important when they're built into the regular routine. Now, I don't want this to be a talk fest. I'm really aware it's after lunch. So I want you to actually feel how this might help. So we don't have a lot of time, but I'm going to ask everyone to stand up, okay? You're probably ready for a stretch, are you? So have a bit of a stretch and a wriggle if you need it. And what I'm going to get you to do is take 3 big breaths with me, okay? We're going to do slow breaths, in through our nose, out through our mouth. And I'm going to try to get you to make the breath out kind of just a little bit longer than the inwards breath, okay? So we'll just do it all together. I know it's a little bit weird breathing in unison, but go with me. Okay, so we're just going to breathe in. And then big slow breath out. Really trying to empty that lung. Big breath in. And then breath out. And one more. Big breath in through the nose. Great. And then all the way out through your mouth. Before you take a seat, just notice anything that you felt in your own system in those few breaths. Anything that changed. You might have felt a little bit dizzy or wobbly. That's sometimes just the oxygen change, but you might actually now be feeling a little bit more alert, or you were pretty relaxed before, but maybe it's helped you to chill a little bit. Take a seat, and I'll just give a moment to understand the benefit of the deep breaths, particularly in the context of stress. Because we talked earlier about that flight and fight mechanism and examined the effect on the brain and our body, but the breathing actually works like a bit of an off switch. It actually triggers something called the vagus nerve. And by initiating that nerve, we can trigger the process that completely switches off that stress response. So fight and flight turns on, but by using breath and engaging in that deliberate calming process, we can help ourselves to feel better. Now, the good news is you might not have felt like you were doing that just right, or it might have felt a little bit weird, but we don't need to worry too much about doing it perfectly. Any slow breathing, any deep breathing will actually initiate that effect and kick off that recovery response. And that can be really important as a quick strategy to promote that recovery and feeling better. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the thinking strategies, which I won't pretend are necessarily super easy, but with dedication and practice, they're definitely achievable, and the payoff is huge. So this is where we really take control of old possibly unconscious threat responses and signals, and practice that process of reevaluating them to see if they're still working for us. And I think that this is a place where we can really draw on the power of the team in these strategies, because when one person is paying attention to changing their thinking patterns, they're in a really good place to be helping the people around them to also become more aware and influence those thinking patterns. And we can even just do that by checking in on each other about how our workloads are, about whether we're stopping for lunch at the right time, taking care of each other to set a more healthy, more resilient workplace. So I'm also just going to quickly talk about mindfulness, because one of the really powerful resilience building strategies is the practice of mindfulness. And I know it's become a bit of a buzzword, but it's proving to be a really effective strategy for improving psychological well-being. So mindfulness is really just simply the practice of cultivating increased intentional and conscious awareness in the present moment. Everyone's mindfully self-aware some of the time, but when we get rushed and busy, when the stress starts to build, we tend to lose our focus and our brains start to get really cluttered. So at those times, when our mind is full, we're much more likely to feel overwhelmed and feel like we're not coping very well. And maybe you can think of a time where you were rushing from a meeting to a meeting, you might have driven yourself somewhere and you got to the end of your drive and you thought, I actually don't remember how I got here. Has anyone had that experience? Okay, so that's that really mindless, overworked, overbusy place that we sometimes get in. It's not good, is it? It's a bit scary when you've had that moment of how did I just drive for half an hour? I don't remember if I stopped at the traffic lights. So mindfulness can be really helpful to turn that around. The other part of mindfulness that's really important is the non-judgmental stance. And as I was talking about later, because our brain is using those shortcuts to help achieve its peak efficiency, we automatically start to judge things as good or bad, right or wrong, fair or unfair, important or unimportant, urgent or non-urgent, so on and so forth. The practice of mindfulness helps us to become a little bit more aware of those automatic judgments that we're making and intentionally take a fresh perspective on it. And when we become more aware that our brain has jumped into auto mode and started judging situations or people, then we're giving ourselves that chance to take a pause and gain a bit of a different perspective. So hopefully before you join the session this afternoon, maybe if you were thinking that breathing practice and mindfulness was just some hippie stuff or something that psychologists do in their office every day, maybe you've been able to get a bit of a different perspective on that and think about the fact that by introducing some simple strategies into the day-to-day, we can actually make changes without it having to be sort of week-long silent retreats. The really exciting news about mindfulness and these sorts of strategies is what we know is when we do these strategies regularly, we see improvements across the board: competence, creativity, psychological well-being, health and engagement. When you're being more mindful, you're being more effective at work. And I know I'm running out of time, but this is such exciting research that I want to talk about. I'm going back to neuroscience, I know. But what's really emerged from really recent research is showing the effect that mindfulness has not just on the way we think, but actually on the structure of our brain. So what we're starting to see is that when we exercise our brain using these strategies, it's like exercising the attention muscle. So we actually start to change the physical structure, just like we can change the physical structure of muscles when we're engaging in exercise at the gym. So this slide is a little bit small to see, I know, but it shows you that the areas of the brain which are involved with that rational, calm thinking. And the little dots that you can see, the blue and orange dots, are measurements of cortical thickness. It's the volume and thickness of brain tissue in these areas. What we can see when we look at this, the orange dots are representing people who don't do meditation and mindfulness, and the blue dots are representing those who do. What this shows us is regular meditators have more brain tissue in the area of their brain that's helping them have rational thinking. So they have actually changed their brain. They've made it thicker in those areas. It's more effective. And a really, really exciting part of this is that over time, as they age, the people who are regularly meditating, that cortical thickness is retained. So that part of the brain stays with a greater volume for longer. So we're keeping our brains healthier as we get older. It's just not in the short term. So we're going to be more effective and we're going to be healthier moving forward. Now, I've been told to wrap up, so I'm not going to work my way through this slide, but this is designed to give you an idea of what a resilient day might look like. Now, this might seem like a lot to do, and it might feel like it's almost a little bit impossible, but if we can be doing even 1 or 2 days that look a little bit more like this, we're starting to be more resilient. We're really putting these things in place. And what does this mean for success at work? Sorry if I zipped through that too fast. Instead of the usual takeaway message, I'm going to leave you with a challenge. I want you to reflect on what you've learned over the last half hour or so and see if you can think of 2 strategies that you can start to put in place. Maybe you could choose one for yourself and one for your employees and your business. Make a commitment, make it a real one. How often will you implement this strategy? Where will you put it in place? When? How will you help yourself to engage in this new behaviour until it starts to become a natural habit? So think really carefully about the strategies you choose because they have to be meaningful to you. And Mikey was talking about meaning as well. It's a really, really important idea. You have to want to make these changes in order to use them regularly enough that they start to become habits. But when you do, it's going to serve you better, it'll serve your business, it'll serve the people that you work with. The potential is huge. Okay. Thank you.